Hello, everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
The day everything collapsed. Have you ever looked at the person you love the most and quietly wondered if one terrible day could erase years of trust, laughter, and shared dreams? I never believed that could happen to my family until one ordinary Tuesday in the United States changed everything. My husband walked through our front door carrying nothing but a small cardboard box from his office, his shoulders lower than I had ever seen. His eyes empty in a way that frightened me more than any bad news ever could. I thought I knew what was inside that box, but I was completely wrong. What he had truly lost that day was far bigger than a paycheck, and before the week was over, I would have to answer the hardest question of my life. Should I stay with the man who seemed to have lost everything? If you enjoy learning English through emotional real-life stories, stay with me until the end, because every chapter of this journey changed the way I see love, marriage, and even myself. My name is Emily, and this is the most painful story I have ever told. Until that afternoon, our life looked surprisingly ordinary. We lived in a quiet neighborhood where children rode bicycles after school, neighbors smiled while walking their dogs, and weekends usually ended with homemade dinners and long conversations on our small backyard patio. We were never the richest family on the street, but we felt lucky. My husband always joked that happiness was cheaper than buying another television, and I laughed every single time. Looking back now, I wish I had listened more carefully to the silence hiding behind his jokes. During the weeks before everything changed, I noticed little things that seemed too small to matter. He stopped talking about work during dinner. He stayed awake much later than usual, staring at his laptop without typing a single word. Even our children asked why Dad smiled less often. I told them he was simply tired. That answer comforted them, but it never comforted me. Sometimes the truth arrives quietly before it arrives loudly. Then came that Tuesday. I heard the garage door open almost an hour earlier than normal. My first thought was that he wanted to surprise us with dinner. Instead, I watched him walk into the kitchen holding that plain brown box. There was a framed family photo inside. His coffee mug, a notebook, a pen. Nothing else. He placed the box on the table and looked at me without saying a word. I had never seen a person lose so much without making a sound. Finally, he whispered, "It's over." Those two words echoed through our home long after he stopped speaking. I wanted to ask 100 questions, but none of them came out. Instead, I simply held his hand. It felt colder than I remembered. That evening, while the children slept upstairs, we sat together in complete silence. Outside, summer rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, fear filled every empty space between us. I kept wondering how quickly an ordinary family could become a family living with uncertainty. In America, people often celebrate success, but they rarely talk about what happens after success disappears. Losing a job is difficult, but losing confidence can be even more dangerous. I did not understand that yet. I only saw the beginning of a storm. Over the next few days, something inside my husband changed. He stopped answering calls from friends. He avoided looking in the mirror. He apologized for things that were never his fault. I tried to encourage him with simple conversations. And sometimes we even practiced easy English together while drinking morning coffee because speaking slowly helped both of us stay calm. Those quiet moments became small islands of peace, but they were not enough to stop the waves that were coming. Then one evening, while organizing our monthly bills, I noticed something that made my heart race faster than ever before. It wasn't another lost payment. It wasn't a letter from the bank. It was something far more unexpected, something my husband had never mentioned. Something that made me question whether I truly knew the man I had married. In that moment, I realized losing everything was only the beginning of our story, not the ending. The next decision I made would change our marriage forever. Watching him break apart. The strangest part of watching someone lose everything is that the real collapse doesn't happen on the day they lose their job, it happens quietly. Afterward, when the house is silent, the children are asleep, and the person you love begins disappearing while sitting right beside you. I thought I was prepared for financial stress, but I wasn't prepared to watch my husband slowly become someone I could barely recognize. What I discovered over the next few days shocked me far more than the cardboard box from his office ever could. And it forced me to ask a question that many families in America never say out loud. What do you do when the person you love starts giving up on themselves? The morning after he came home with the box, he woke up before sunrise, just as he always had. For one brief moment, everything looked normal. He put on his favorite blue shirt, reached for his car keys, then suddenly froze in the middle of the kitchen. His hand slowly fell to his side. He stared at the floor for several long seconds before quietly putting the keys back on the counter. I pretended not to notice because I knew his pride was already hurting. Sometimes kindness is not asking a question that someone is not ready to answer. The days that followed felt strangely longer than usual. My husband had always been the loudest person in our home. He laughed during breakfast, sang while making coffee, and somehow managed to turn grocery shopping into a funny adventure. Now the television stayed off. The music stopped. Even our dog kept walking to the front door every afternoon, expecting the old version of him to come home. Instead, the quiet man sitting in the living room barely looked up from the couch. Our children noticed everything even though we tried to protect them. One evening my youngest daughter asked me, "Mom, is Dad sick?" I smiled and told her he was just tired, but after she went upstairs, I sat alone in the kitchen and cried for the first time. I wasn't crying because of money. I was crying because I missed the man who was still living under the same roof. In the United States, people often measure success by promotions, salaries, or the size of a house. But inside many homes, there are invisible battles that neighbors never see. Mental exhaustion can quietly steal confidence before anyone realizes what is happening. I began reading about stress and learned that losing a career can affect the brain almost like losing a loved one. That explained his silence, but it did not tell me how to help him. So I started with something very small. Every morning I made 2 cups of coffee and invited him to read one simple English paragraph with me. Nothing complicated. Just a few slow sentences about everyday life. Reading aloud gave us a reason to sit together without talking about fear. Sometimes he smiled after saying a sentence correctly. Those tiny smiles became the brightest part of my mornings. They reminded me that healing rarely begins with a miracle. It usually begins with one small habit repeated again and again. Still, something continued to bother me. My husband kept checking his phone, then locking it immediately whenever I walked into the room. Late one night, I woke up and noticed his side of the bed was empty. I found him sitting alone on the back patio, staring into the darkness with his phone in his hands. The screen reflected across his face, but I couldn't see what he was reading. When he realized I was standing there, he quickly locked the phone and slipped it into his pocket. "It's nothing," he said with a weak smile. But it didn't feel like nothing. The next afternoon, while folding laundry, I accidentally noticed several unopened envelopes hidden beneath a stack of old magazines in the hallway cabinet. They were addressed to my husband. I had never seen them before. My heart started beating faster. Why would he hide letters from me? Were they unpaid bills? A legal notice? Something even worse? I wanted to believe there was a simple explanation, but every unanswered question created another one. That evening he looked at me with tired eyes and quietly said, "There's something I haven't told you yet." Before I could answer, his phone rang. He looked at the screen, turned pale, and immediately walked outside to take the call. I stood frozen in the kitchen, watching through the window as he whispered to someone I couldn't see. Then, for the first time in our marriage, I saw tears running down his face while he begged, "Please, just give me a little more time." The question that haunted me. I never imagined that the most dangerous thing in my marriage would not be another woman, another family, or even the loss of money. It was my own imagination. The less my husband explained, the more stories my mind created, and every silent minute became another piece of evidence against him. Looking back now, I realize how quickly fear can become a terrible storyteller. But on that night, standing behind the kitchen window while watching my husband whisper into his phone with tears running down his face, I believed our life was about to fall apart forever. After he ended the call, he stayed outside for several more minutes. I watched him wipe his face before coming back inside, forcing a smile that looked more painful than his tears. I wanted to ask who had called. I wanted to ask why he was hiding unopened letters. I wanted to ask why he suddenly looked like a man carrying the weight of the entire world. Instead, I asked the smallest question I could think of. "Are you okay?" He nodded almost immediately. "Yes, I'm just tired." I knew it wasn't true. Sometimes the shortest answers hide the biggest secrets. That night, I barely slept. Every sound inside the house seemed louder than usual. The refrigerator hummed. The air conditioner turned on and off. Even the rain tapping against the windows felt like someone knocking on our door. Around 3 in the morning, I quietly walked into the living room and saw the cardboard box from his office still sitting beside the couch. I opened it again, hoping I had missed something. Inside were only ordinary things: a family picture, a notebook, an old coffee mug, several pens, and a folded piece of paper. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. It wasn't a goodbye letter. It wasn't a warning from his company. It was a list written in his own handwriting. At the top he had written, "Things I must fix before it's too late." Underneath were short sentences. "Find work. Protect the kids. Don't let Emily worry. Stay strong. Keep smiling." Reading those words broke my heart. While I had been wondering whether he was hiding something from me, he had been trying to protect me from his own pain. Still, the hidden letters and mysterious phone calls refused to leave my mind. The next morning, after taking the children to school, I drove home through familiar streets that suddenly felt unfamiliar. At every traffic light, my thoughts became darker. In the United States, financial stress affects millions of families every year. And experts often say that money problems can become one of the biggest sources of conflict in marriage. I kept asking myself whether we were becoming another statistic. Was this only about losing his job, or was something much worse waiting for me? To calm my racing thoughts, I did something that had become part of my daily routine. I opened a simple English reading app on my phone and slowly read a short story aloud while parked in the driveway. One day at a time, the story repeated. The words were easy, but somehow they slowed my breathing. Practicing English for just a few minutes reminded me that understanding comes slowly, just like healing. When I walked inside the house, my husband was sitting at the dining table with a calculator, several papers, and those same unopened envelopes spread out in front of him. He looked surprised to see me home so early and quickly gathered everything into a pile. This time I didn't stay silent. I gently placed my hand over his and whispered, "Please, don't carry this alone." He looked at me for a long time before quietly saying, "Emily, if I tell you everything today, I'm afraid you'll never look at me the same way again." My heart felt as if it had stopped beating. Every terrible possibility rushed into my mind at once. I prepared myself to hear about hidden debt, gambling, betrayal, or something even more devastating. Instead of speaking, he slowly reached into his pocket, pulled out a single folded document, and placed it on the table between us. I looked down at the official seal printed across the top of the page. The moment I read the first line, I realized this wasn't just about losing a job anymore. It was something that could change our family's future forever. The truth behind his silence. There are moments when your heart prepares for the worst, only to discover that reality is completely different, but somehow even more heartbreaking. As I stared at the document lying on our dining table, I expected to uncover a hidden betrayal, a secret debt, or a mistake that would destroy our marriage forever. Instead, I found something that made me realize I had misunderstood my husband every single day since he came home with that small cardboard box. What he had been hiding was not another life. It was the quiet battle to keep our family from seeing him fall apart. I slowly picked up the paper with trembling hands. It wasn't a lawsuit. It wasn't a divorce document. It was an official notice explaining the end of his employment benefits and the timeline for his health insurance coverage. Attached to it was another page filled with handwritten calculations. Every number represented a bill. Mortgage, electricity, car insurance, groceries, school expenses. He had crossed out his own personal spending completely. No new clothes. No coffee shop visits. No hobbies. At the bottom of the page, he had written one sentence that nearly made me cry. Make sure the kids never feel afraid. I looked across the table at my husband. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the floor, as though admitting the truth was harder than losing the job itself. Finally, he spoke in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it. I wasn't hiding another life, Emily. I was hiding how ashamed I felt. Those words stayed with me longer than anything else he said that day. In many families across the United States, people talk openly about career success, but much less about failure. Losing a job can make someone feel as though they have lost their identity. My husband had spent years believing his value came from being able to provide. When that disappeared, he began believing that he had disappeared too. I moved my chair closer and took his hand. It felt warmer than it had in days, perhaps because for the first time he wasn't carrying the burden alone. He admitted that the mysterious phone calls weren't from someone he was hiding from me. They were from the bank, the mortgage company, and a recruiter who kept delaying decisions. The unopened envelopes I had found weren't secret letters. He had hidden them because he wanted one more day before facing another reminder that life had changed. I felt guilty for every terrible story my imagination had invented. Fear had filled in the blanks long before truth had the chance to speak. That afternoon, we decided to stop pretending everything was normal. We made coffee, sat together at the kitchen table, and listed every challenge on a piece of paper. Surprisingly, seeing our problems written down made them look smaller than the monsters living inside our minds. Before we discussed money again, I suggested something unusual. Let's read one short English story first. He looked confused, then laughed for the first time in over a week. We opened a beginner reading passage about hope after failure. The sentences were simple. Every new day is another chance. Small steps become big changes. We read slowly, helping each other pronounce unfamiliar words. It lasted only 5 minutes, but those 5 minutes reminded us that progress doesn't have to be dramatic. Sometimes rebuilding begins with breathing calmly together. That evening, our children came home from school laughing about a science project. My husband smiled naturally for the first time in days. It wasn't a perfect smile, but it was real. Watching him laugh with them reminded me that they didn't need a perfect father. They needed their father. Later that night, after everyone was asleep, he opened his laptop and showed me dozens of job applications he had already submitted. I had assumed he was giving up. In reality, he had been fighting every single day without telling anyone. Then he quietly admitted something he had never said before. "There's one application I haven't told you about because I didn't want you to get your hopes up." He turned the screen toward me. An email notification had just arrived. My pulse quickened as I saw the subject line. It wasn't a rejection. It wasn't an acceptance either. It was an invitation that could completely change the direction of our lives, but only if he was willing to take a risk neither of us had ever imagined. I chose love, not escape. What if the biggest decision in your marriage wasn't made during the happiest day of your life, but during the moment when everything looked impossible? As I stared at the email glowing on my husband's laptop screen, I realized that this wasn't simply about a new job opportunity. It was a test of who he had become after weeks of fear, silence, and sleepless nights. I had spent so much energy wondering whether I should stay with him that I almost forgot to ask a more important question: if we stayed together, what kind of couple did we want to become? The email invited my husband to attend a final interview with a growing company just a few hours away from our home. The position offered hope, but nothing was guaranteed. There would be several rounds of interviews, technical evaluations, and a waiting period that could last weeks. My husband looked at me and quietly said, "Maybe I shouldn't go. What if I fail again?" Hearing those words hurt more than losing the job itself. The confident man I had married would have accepted the challenge immediately. The man sitting beside me was asking permission to believe in himself again. I reached across the table and closed the laptop. "Go," I said. "If you don't get this job, we'll still be okay. But if you never try, you'll never forgive yourself." For the first time in weeks, he looked directly into my eyes instead of the floor. That single moment reminded me that encouragement isn't about promising success. It's about refusing to let fear make the final decision. The next morning, we began changing small things around the house. Instead of pretending everything was fine, we created simple daily routines that helped us feel stronger. We walked together after dinner through our neighborhood, waving to neighbors we had been avoiding. We cooked meals at home instead of ordering takeout. We laughed when our recipes failed. Life wasn't suddenly easier, but it felt lighter. I also suggested that we continue reading one short English story together every morning. At first it seemed unrelated to our problems, but those quiet reading sessions became something much deeper. We practiced simple phrases like, "Tomorrow is a new beginning," and "Hope grows one step at a time." Reading slowly forced us to slow our thoughts as well. Sometimes learning a language isn't only about vocabulary. It's about teaching your mind to breathe instead of panic. During one of our evening walks, my husband finally admitted something that shocked me. "I wasn't afraid of losing the job," he confessed. "I was afraid of watching you lose respect for me." I stopped walking and looked at him in complete silence. I had been worrying that he no longer trusted me, while he had been worrying that I no longer believed in him. How many marriages slowly fall apart because two people are protecting each other with silence instead of honesty? That realization changed everything. From that night on, we promised each other one simple rule. No matter how uncomfortable the truth felt, we would always say it before our imagination had the chance to invent something worse. It wasn't a magical solution, but it rebuilt trust one conversation at a time. In the United States, many marriage counselors encourage couples to communicate openly during financial hardship because unspoken fear often causes more damage than the problem itself. I finally understood why. Once we stopped hiding our emotions, we stopped fighting invisible enemies inside our own minds. A few days later, The morning of the interview finally arrived. I helped him straighten his tie, just as I had done countless times before, but this morning felt different. Before leaving, he hugged me longer than usual and whispered, "Thank you for staying." I smiled and replied, "You never lost everything. You still have us." He drove away, and I stood on the porch watching his car disappear around the corner. For the first time in weeks, I felt genuine hope. Hours passed without a phone call. Afternoon turned into evening. Every sound from my phone made my heart race. Then, just after sunset, an unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. I answered immediately, expecting to hear my husband's excited voice. Instead, a calm stranger introduced herself from the company and said, "Mrs. Carter, there's something you should know before your husband gets home." In that instant, every hopeful thought disappeared, and I realized our hardest test might not be over after all. Rebuilding one small day at a time. The phone call I received that evening made my heart stop before I even heard the full sentence. My hands became cold, and for a few terrifying seconds, every terrible possibility rushed into my mind. Had something happened on the highway? Had my husband failed the interview? Had our last chance disappeared before it had even begun? The woman on the other end spoke calmly, but her first words sounded much louder than anything else around me. "Please don't worry," she said. Those 3 words usually mean someone is already worried. I took a slow breath and listened carefully. She explained that she worked in the company's human resources department. During the interview, my husband had impressed the hiring team with his experience, honesty, and problem-solving skills. However, they had noticed something unusual. He seemed extremely nervous and carried an overwhelming amount of emotional pressure. Before making a final hiring decision, they wanted to know if he would be comfortable participating in an employee wellness program designed to help people returning to work after major life setbacks. I closed my eyes in relief. Nothing terrible had happened. In fact, someone had noticed exactly what I had been seeing at home for weeks. The woman wasn't calling to reject him. She simply wanted to make sure he understood the support available if he joined the company. When the call ended, I sat quietly in the kitchen, thinking about how differently I would have interpreted that same conversation only a month earlier. Back then, I probably would have heard only the word problem. Now I heard another word instead, opportunity. That evening my husband came home looking exhausted. Before he could speak, I smiled and asked, "How did it go?" He looked surprised. "You already know they called?" I nodded. He sat beside me and laughed softly. "I thought they were calling because I embarrassed myself." Instead, he told me something unexpected. During the interview, one manager had asked him what the hardest lesson of the past month had been. Rather than pretending everything was perfect, he answered honestly. He admitted that losing his job had shaken his confidence, but also taught him that asking for help was not a sign of weakness. The interview room had become completely silent. Then one interviewer smiled and thanked him for being genuine. "Most candidates tell us why they're strong," my husband repeated. "They wanted to know whether I could grow." That sentence stayed in my mind for days. Sometimes life isn't testing our abilities. It's testing whether we can continue growing after disappointment. From that week forward, we stopped measuring success only by results. Instead, we celebrated small victories. A peaceful breakfast together. A family walk after dinner. A job application completed without losing hope. Even reading one page of an easy English story every morning became part of our routine. We would take turns reading simple sentences aloud, correcting each other's pronunciation with laughter instead of embarrassment. Those quiet moments reminded us that progress rarely happens all at once. One word becomes one sentence. One sentence becomes confidence. One confident day becomes a different life. Scientists often explain that repeating small positive habits helps reduce stress by giving the brain predictable moments of success. Looking back, I believe those little routines saved us almost as much as any future paycheck could. Our children noticed the changes too. They began smiling more because we smiled more. They stopped asking whether Dad was okay because they could already see the answer. The house didn't become quieter because our problems disappeared. It became warmer because fear no longer controlled every conversation. Then, exactly 1 week after the interview, another email arrived. My husband didn't open it immediately. Instead, he placed the laptop between us and whispered, "No matter what this says, thank you for never giving up on me." I reached for his hand, and together we clicked on the message. My eyes moved to the first sentence. I smiled before I even reached the second line. But just as we thought the hardest chapter was finally ending, my husband's phone vibrated again. He looked at the screen, and the color disappeared from his face. It was a call from someone connected to his former company, and after everything we had survived, I suddenly realized the past was not finished with us yet. What America taught our family. Just when I thought our story had finally turned toward hope, the past knocked on our door one more time. My husband stared silently at the phone vibrating in his hand, and I could tell immediately that this wasn't an ordinary call. His smile disappeared. His shoulders tightened again. For one frightening second, I felt as though we had been pulled back to the darkest day of our lives. I didn't know who was calling, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever happened next would test whether we had truly changed, or whether we had only been pretending to be stronger. He answered quietly and stepped outside onto the back patio. I stayed inside, trying not to imagine the worst, but old fears have a strange way of returning when life suddenly becomes uncertain again. A few minutes later, he walked back into the kitchen, looking thoughtful instead of terrified. "That was my former manager," he said. I immediately asked, "Is something wrong?" He slowly shook his head. Actually, something unexpected happened. His previous company had completed an internal review after several weeks of restructuring. During that process, senior leadership discovered that several decisions had been made too quickly. My husband's manager called to apologize personally, explaining that losing his position had never been about poor performance. The company had simply eliminated several departments during a difficult financial period. There would be no offer to return, but there was something almost as valuable. His former employer had offered to become a professional reference and personally recommend him to future employers. I watched tears fill my husband's eyes again, but this time they were different. These weren't tears of defeat. They were tears of relief. For weeks, he had secretly believed he had failed everyone around him. Now he finally understood that sometimes life changes for reasons completely outside our control. That realization changed the way our entire family thought about failure. In America, careers can change quickly. Companies grow. Companies shrink. Entire industries evolve faster than anyone expects. One lesson we learned is that your job is important, but it should never become your entire identity. Skills can be rebuilt. Confidence can return. Character is what remains when everything else changes. Over the following weeks, our home slowly became brighter. We laughed more during dinner. We invited neighbors over for a weekend barbecue instead of hiding inside the house. The children noticed the difference immediately. One afternoon, my youngest smiled and said, "Dad laughs like before." None of us said anything for a moment because we all knew exactly what she meant. Healing had happened so gradually that we almost missed it. Every morning we continued our little English routine. We chose short stories with simple vocabulary about hope, kindness, and second chances. Sometimes we practiced expressions like, every challenge teaches something new, or tomorrow begins with today's choices. They were easy sentences, but they became part of our daily conversations. I realized that learning English wasn't only helping us improve a language. It was helping us slow down, listen carefully, and enjoy quiet moments together. Looking back, those few peaceful minutes every morning became one of the strongest habits we ever built. Research often shows that families who maintain consistent daily routines during stressful periods recover emotionally more quickly. We didn't know the science while we were living it. We simply knew that small moments of connection made difficult days easier to carry. One Saturday afternoon, while cleaning the garage together, my husband stopped and looked at the same cardboard box he had carried home on the day everything collapsed. Instead of throwing it away, he smiled and said, "Let's keep it." I laughed in surprise. Why would we keep that? He gently placed the family photograph back inside and answered, "Because I never want to forget that losing a job isn't the same as losing a family." That sentence became one of the most meaningful lessons of our marriage. We had almost allowed fear to convince us that our future had disappeared, when in reality our greatest strength had been sitting around the dinner table every single night. Then, on a quiet Sunday evening, just as life finally felt peaceful again, my husband opened his email one last time. A new message had arrived from the company where he had interviewed weeks earlier. This time the subject line was only 4 simple words, but the moment I read them, I knew our lives were about to change forever. Our home slowly smiled again. I thought the biggest surprise of our journey would be whether my husband found another job. I was wrong. The real surprise was discovering how completely a family can change after surviving the hardest season together. When my husband clicked on that email, neither of us spoke. We simply looked at the screen as if our future had been condensed into a few short sentences. Then I saw the words we had almost stopped believing we would ever read. "We are pleased to offer you the position." I burst into tears before he even reached the second paragraph. My husband didn't celebrate immediately. Instead, he closed the laptop, wrapped his arms around me, and whispered something I will never forget. "This isn't the happiest day because I got a job. It's the happiest day because I never lost you." Those words reminded me that the greatest victories in life are often invisible. They happen inside people's hearts long before they appear on paper. The new position wasn't perfect. It required learning new systems, adapting to a different team, and proving himself all over again. But this time he walked into the challenge with a completely different mindset. Instead of believing his worth depended on success, he understood that success grows from resilience. Every morning before work, we still sat together with coffee and read a short English passage. Sometimes it was only 5 or 6 simple sentences about everyday life in America. We practiced pronunciation, laughed at our mistakes, and reminded each other that improvement comes from consistency, not perfection. Those quiet moments became our family's favorite tradition. They were never really about grammar. They were about beginning every day with hope instead of fear. Our children noticed the difference more than anyone. The house sounded different. Laughter returned to the kitchen. Music played while dinner cooked. Weekend mornings no longer felt heavy. One Saturday, my son asked his father to help build a small birdhouse for the backyard. As they worked together, I watched from the window and realized that children rarely remember how much money their parents earned. They remember who showed up, who listened, and who stayed. That simple afternoon became one of my favorite memories because it reminded me that emotional security is often worth more than financial security. Living in the United States has taught me many practical lessons about family life. Careers can change without warning. Markets rise and fall. Companies reorganize. None of those things are fully under our control. What we can control is how we respond. We learned to keep an emergency savings plan, to communicate honestly before problems became arguments, and to protect our mental health just as carefully as we protected our finances. Those lessons didn't come from books. They came from living through uncertainty together. Looking back, I also realized something deeply personal. During the darkest weeks, I had spent too much time asking, why is this happening to us? Eventually, I replaced that question with another one. What is this teaching us? That small change transformed my attitude. Research in psychology often suggests that people who focus on growth after adversity recover more effectively than those who stay trapped inside blame or regret. I didn't know the scientific term for it then. I simply knew that hope became easier when I looked forward instead of backward. One evening, while organizing old papers, I found the handwritten list my husband had made after losing his job. Find work. Protect the kids. Don't let Emily worry. Stay strong. Keep smiling. I quietly added one more sentence at the bottom. Never face tomorrow alone. When he found the paper later that night, he smiled without saying a word. Sometimes love doesn't need long conversations. Sometimes one handwritten sentence says everything. Just when we believed every chapter of the story had finally been written, another unexpected letter arrived in our mailbox. It wasn't a bill. It wasn't another job offer. It came from someone we hadn't heard from in years, and the first line inside the envelope made both of us stop breathing. We looked at each other in complete silence because we both understood the same thing at exactly the same moment. Our greatest lesson might still be waiting ahead. Looking back changed everything. If someone had told me a year earlier that the worst season of my marriage would eventually become the reason our family grew stronger, I would have smiled politely and never believed them. Pain doesn't feel like a gift while you're living through it. It feels heavy, unfair, and endless. Yet as I held the unexpected letter in my hands that evening, I realized something surprising. The story I had been telling myself about our life was finally changing. We were no longer the family that almost lost everything. We were becoming the family that learned how to rebuild together. I slowly opened the envelope while my husband stood beside me. It wasn't from a bank, a lawyer, or another company. It was from one of his former coworkers, someone we hadn't spoken to in a long time. Inside was a handwritten letter thanking my husband for the kindness he had shown years earlier by helping new employees feel welcome during difficult times. Several people from the old team had decided to organize a small reunion dinner, and they hoped he would come. My husband laughed softly, almost in disbelief. I thought everyone had forgotten about me, he whispered. I looked at him and answered, good people are remembered much longer than successful people. That invitation reminded both of us that character often leaves a deeper impression than achievements ever can. A few days later, we attended the gathering. Walking into the restaurant, I expected awkward conversations about jobs and promotions. Instead, people hugged my husband, asked how he was doing, and shared stories about how he had encouraged them when they were struggling. One coworker smiled and said, you probably don't remember this, but when I almost quit my first week, you told me that difficult days don't last forever. My husband looked genuinely surprised. On the drive home, he admitted that he barely remembered saying those words. Isn't it strange how the smallest acts of kindness often become the biggest memories for someone else? That night we talked for hours after the children went to bed. We realized that for weeks we had measured our life only by what we had lost. We rarely talked about everything we still had. A loving family, healthy children, friends who cared, a home filled with laughter again. Gratitude didn't erase our past, but it completely changed the way we remembered it. Living in the United States has taught us that life can change quickly, both for better and for worse. Careers shift. The economy changes. Unexpected challenges appear without warning. But one lesson stayed with us above everything else. Never allow temporary circumstances to define permanent relationships. Jobs come and go. Love must be protected every single day. Our morning English reading tradition continued, even after life became busy again. Sometimes we practice simple sentences like, every ending creates a new beginning, or, hope grows stronger when shared. Those easy expressions slowly became part of our everyday conversations. Looking back now, I realize we weren't only learning English. We were learning patience, consistency, and the power of beginning again, one small sentence at a time. Psychologists often explain that couples who reflect on difficult experiences together tend to build stronger emotional resilience. We didn't know that research while we were living our story, but it perfectly described what happened to us. Every honest conversation made the next one easier. Every small victory gave us confidence for the next challenge. One quiet afternoon, while cleaning a shelf in our living room, I found the framed family photo that had been sitting inside my husband's cardboard box on the day he lost his job. I gently wiped away the dust and placed it back in the center of our home. It no longer reminded me of fear. It reminded me that our family had survived something we once believed would break us forever. My husband walked over, smiled at the picture, and said, "I'm glad you stayed." I smiled back and quietly replied, "I'm glad you never stopped fighting." We stood there together for a long moment, believing our story had finally reached its peaceful ending. Then my phone vibrated with a message from our oldest child that simply read, "Mom, I need to tell you something important tonight." The words were short, but the feeling in my heart was immediate. Life was preparing to teach our family one more unforgettable lesson before this journey was truly complete. Yes, I stayed with him. When my phone lit up with my child's message saying, "Mom, I need to tell you something important tonight," my heart immediately returned to the fear I thought we had already left behind. Isn't it amazing how one short sentence can make old memories rush back in seconds? After everything our family had survived, I wondered if another storm was waiting just beyond the door. But sometimes life saves its greatest surprise for the very end, not to break your heart, but to show you how much stronger it has become. That evening we all gathered around the dinner table, just as we always did. My husband had finished another successful week at his new job. The children were laughing about school. And for the first time in many months, our home felt peaceful without pretending to be perfect. Then our oldest child looked at both of us and quietly said, "I've been watching everything that happened this year." My husband and I exchanged nervous glances. We had worked so hard to protect our children from our worries that we believed they hadn't noticed very much. We were completely wrong. Our child smiled gently and continued, "I know Dad lost his job. I know both of you were scared. But I also saw something else. I never saw either of you give up on each other." Those words filled the room with silence. I felt tears forming before I even realized I was crying. Children often understand much more than adults imagine. They don't remember every conversation, but they remember how people treat each other during difficult moments. That simple observation became one of the greatest gifts our family had ever received. Later that evening, after the children had gone upstairs, my husband and I sat on the back patio where so many difficult conversations had begun months earlier. The same chairs were there. The same quiet neighborhood surrounded us. But everything inside us had changed. He reached for my hand and asked me the question that had inspired this entire story. "When I lost everything, did you ever think about leaving me?" I looked at him honestly because we had promised never to hide the truth again. Yes, I answered softly. For a moment, I was afraid. Not because I stopped loving you, but because I didn't know whether we were strong enough to survive. He nodded slowly. I was afraid too, he admitted. Not of losing my job. I was afraid of losing you. We both laughed through our tears because we finally understood how much unnecessary fear had grown in the silence between us. If we had spoken honestly sooner, we could have saved ourselves many sleepless nights. Living in the United States has taught us that uncertainty is part of modern life. Careers change. Unexpected setbacks happen. Financial pressure can affect any family. But one lesson has become the foundation of our marriage. Never make permanent decisions during temporary pain. Give each other time to heal, to explain, and to grow before fear writes the ending of your story. We still begin many mornings with a cup of coffee and a few minutes of slow English reading together. Sometimes the passages are incredibly simple. Hope begins today. Love grows through patience. Small steps create big changes. Those sentences are easy enough for English learners, but after everything we experienced, they also became reminders of how we rebuilt our own lives. Learning English became more than language practice. It became a peaceful daily ritual that reminded us to slow down, listen carefully, and appreciate progress instead of perfection. Looking back now, I finally know the answer to the question in this video's title. Did I stay with my husband after he lost everything? Yes, I did. But the real truth is even more surprising. He never truly lost everything. He still had his integrity. He still had his kindness. He still had the courage to keep trying. Most importantly, we still had each other. Jobs can disappear. Savings can shrink. Confidence can fade for a while. But when two people choose honesty over pride, communication over silence, and hope over fear, they often discover that the strongest foundation of a family cannot be taken away by any setback. If this story reminds you of your own life, remember this. The darkest chapter is rarely the final chapter. Sometimes it is simply the page where a stronger version of you quietly begins. Thank you for practicing English with me through this real-life story. I hope every sentence brought you not only new vocabulary, but also new hope for your own journey. That's all for today. I'll create many more videos like this in the future. Please subscribe so you don't miss the next story.